think I'm gonna ask you a question and then other people will intervene. You can, vous pouvez écrire des questions ou en poser. Je pense que c'est libre. S'il y a peut-être des gens qui, maybe there is some people who prefer to write the questions, comme vous voulez. Donc par écrit ou par oral. Thank you, Babette, so for this talk. Well, I feel overwhelmed. You are drawing some image of the world that that is very pessimistic, and this what comes out at first when I'm thinking of all, what I've heard is the obsolescence of man, the title of Anders. It seems like we are crushed by this idea, and this is something that, as I was telling, is very important for Heidegger and very, very ignored by the positivist thinking. And nowadays, there is a partition, like the press and I would say the positivist thinking that is, let's say, a kind of common sense that is shared among the media and everything, is not seeing this, but this appears in science fiction. And there is, so I'm very puzzled by this dichotomy, this very dramatic tone that and feeling that we feel in front of technology that is only expressed by science fiction and by some guys, some continental guys that are seeing very far and that are making some hypotheses about our destiny. And the positivist thinking is not drawing and seeing those hypotheses. How do you feel about this strange dichotomy?
Thank you. That's a very good question. As the Germans say, liegt auf der Hand. It is relevant to the embrace, and this goes back to the Vienna Circle, one of the wonderful things that one has, and people have begun to write the history of analytic philosophy already. It's a very recent thing, the history of analytic philosophy, but already it has a history, and it has historians, you know, a number of historians. And most people agree, although there are some who, it's always difficult when you write a history to find the beginning. And the trouble is, it begins fairly clearly with the Vienna Circle. But even there, it's complicated, because who's Wittgenstein? Is Wittgenstein analytic? Is he continental? Well, he's certainly analytic, but maybe he's continental. No, he's not. So it becomes a very difficult question. The point you made in your introduction, Nicolas, is probably the most important aspect of it. It is the desire to appear scientific. And this means, and this is why it goes back with, however you like to put it, to the Vienna Circle, because of what is the essence of the analytic, which is to a certain extent to streamline language so that you can eliminate as much as possible the dangers of metaphor, of risky reference, and be as plain as possible. There are two trends in that. One of those goes to the very barefoot account, which is the person in the street who's meant to have access to anything. And the other, which tries to go for a kind of formulaic, very, very clear, logical. That tended not to work because it's too hard for the proponents, I think. And a certain amount of plainness always is appealing. But of course, whose plainness was always the question. Whose man in the street are you talking to? Maybe not the homeless person, maybe someone else. Very big question. Now, what imitating the sciences forces you to do, And this is a great problem because it's the older tradition of philosophy. Philosophy exists at the university since the universities were founded to serve theology. The only reason we have philosophy on the curriculum at any university is because of theology. So one of the important things to remember is that philosophy is meant to be the ancilla or handmaiden of theology. Well, philosophy does not like that, and no one cares about theology, so there. So analytic philosophy said, we will be the handmaiden or servant of science. But science does not need philosophy. Newsflash. So science does not need philosophy to be its handmaiden because science can do everything philosophy can better. So it's very, very important. Philosophy is needed by theology because theology is dealing with God, and God doesn't make any sense to anyone, and so you need a middle point. Logically, you need a middle. What Kant talks about, the mediating, the third, or what Wilfrid Sellers calls thirdness. You need that, and that's what philosophy provides. Science doesn't need it, but analytic philosophy, though, will never, never, never criticize science. Occasionally, they will say they're confused. They don't understand that they need philosophy of science. We will explain to the scientists that they need philosophy of science. And when they learn enough philosophy, they will agree. But I think it's not more, I mean, it's hugely complicated in all the different permutations of your question, but it's not more complicated than wanting to be on the side of science. And of course, continental philosophy typically raises criticisms, which gets it in trouble. And that's why Don Heidi said, you can't have any negative views. And it's also why even Heidegger was careful, because his good friend was Werner Heisenberg, and he did not want to be so negative. So at the end of the question concerning technology, we get a beautiful quote, very ambiguous, very ambivalent, from Hölderlin. And there, it's actually a quote from homeopathy. It's very strange. It's the doctrine of signatures. It couldn't be more medieval or more Renaissance if he had tried. You're going to get your rescue if you go into the danger. But it's not because it's not dangerous. It's dangerous, but that's where if you're going to get rescued, that's where it'll be. I always like to think of rescue remedy because when we have stress, we need that. But in any case.
But anyway, it's looking more like something is existential, what you're saying, like you're gonna have your rescue in the danger more than scientific.
True, but you know, once upon a time, and for the Queen of England, homeopathic things, and for the person who won the Nobel Prize for discovering the AIDS virus, Luc Montagnier, and then got into trouble because he tried to research homeopathy. There's a scientific basis to homeopathy.
Stop. I want to say that homeopathy is proven by science.
He's been censored or what?
I don't know.
So that works. Win a Nobel Prize for discovering the virus. No, just because I'm sorry, but you can't saying something that is false. No, homeopathy doesn't work. It's proven by science. It's so proven by science that if you make the list of different studies that try to show the homeopathy work, those studies had the more problems and inaccuracy is those who show the most that homeopathy works. So we can conclude that homeopathy doesn't work. And Luc Montagnier, he's nobody know what happened with Montagnier because nobody never could repeat his experience with the memory of water. So I'm very sorry to disturb you in this way, but homeopathy does not work. It's a scientific fact, and you can't physically get against a fact. The fact are facts.
Okay. I'm going to agree with that because, of course, in my own training in biology, one of the problems is how to design an experiment. And experiments are designed and they produce particular results, but the results they produce are a function of the design. And of course, if you are a scholar and if you are a young scientist, you are going to need to learn how to design an effective experiment. The same is true in sociology and the social sciences. You've got to design your experiment, and Heidegger puts it a beautiful way, so that what you, and in fact, he's stealing from Immanuel Kant. So Kant says you cannot simply observe a lot of cases and see it doesn't work. That's not an experiment. You've got to pose a question. You've got to be able to question in such a way that the results you get actually confirm one thing or another. And it's very difficult to come up with a good experimental design of any kind. It's always hard. And that's what young people do. That's how you get a PhD. That's how you are going to get a new publication published, where you will come up with a better experimental design than someone else. Now, I mention Montagnier because he's not the only Nobel Prize winner, chemist, French, they're all French, it's very interesting, who tries to prove a scientific basis for the memory of what, as it's also called, and some Japanese also, because this was also done a very, very long time ago by the say Benveniste, not the linguist Benveniste, the chemist. Benveniste who did the same thing, and he was subject to academic mobbing immediately. And this was very surprising because he had to have a redaction even before people could check. So it's very complicated. Now, I think the story is not yet finished to say firmly that it does or doesn't. I don't know. I think it's very complicated, and I don't know. To say that we know that it doesn't work would be to say that science has come to an end. We've reached the end of the universe, and we can say, okay, you're finished, no more questions. I don't think that's the way science works. I don't think that's the way the world works. I think that there are complexities, and there may be more than we understand. Shakespeare says there may be more in heaven than are dreamt, and hell that are dreamt of in your philosophy. It's a very good statement because it means something escapes. And we as scientists and philosophers want to look also for that. Otherwise, we can have dogma. And that's what you're advocating. You're saying, we know it doesn't work. Do we? The Queen of England only uses homeopathy. She's not dead yet. I think Charles is very unhappy about this. Maybe she should use regular doctors and die, but she uses homeopathy. And the problem with homeopathy, this is why I don't really talk about it.
Reductor at the.
You need more information than you can get. Homeopathy requires actual attention to the individual. That's too hard. From moment to moment, hour to hour, day to day. Most of our doctors don't pay any attention to that. Only sick people do.
Deux mots là-dessus, parce que c'est intéressant. Je participe depuis maintenant 10 mois au moins à l'acupuncture. J'avais autrefois des problèmes avec un genou qui me donnait beaucoup de peine à marcher. Et après 2 ou 3 sessions, je n'ai plus. C'est loin. La médecine chinoise, par exemple, traditionnelle, est une médecine qui est basée sur beaucoup de petits remèdes, jour par jour, 10, peut-être 5, 10, 20 fois par jour. C'est très différent de la médecine occidentale. Et justement, ce que dit Babette là, c'est que on peut faire des expériences avec homéopathie, etc. Mais il faut que ces expériences soient les mêmes que les docteurs homéopathes ont pour leurs patients. Et c'est ça qui fait une différence. Parce que si on prend par exemple en médecine chinoise, on me dit, vous prenez ça 3 pilules tous les 2 heures pendant toute la journée. C'est pas une chose qu'un docteur occidental pourrait me dire. Et c'est ça qui fait... S'il y a beaucoup de différences entre ces 2 approches, et ce sont des différences qui sont vraiment... les rend pratiquement incompréhensibles les uns aux autres.
non, mais ce que je veux dire, c'est que vous êtes bien d'accord que si on essaie de mettre un protocole expérimental pour l'homéopathie, mais en prenant en compte justement ce fait que les docteurs homéopathes suivent leurs patients, leur parlent, les écoutent et prescrivent le médicament idéal, ça va ça va interférer avec tous les effets connus tels que l'effet placebo, l'effet contextuel, etc., etc. Donc pour l'instant, en fait, on est un peu bloqué dans cette situation où les homéopathes défendent un peu derrière le bouclier que on ne peut pas vérifier, donc on va dire que ça marche.
Ah oui,
Alors
non,
que
non.
la science est un peu dans l'autre sens. Et donc,
On va
qui
pas,
plus est,
cher ami de l'EPFL, le but, c'est peut-être pas de faire un débat sur l'homéopathie en soi, mais c'est sûr que
Baptiste, mais j'ai vu
Babette
que ce
n'est pas
truc
forcément d'accord avec toi à propos de
dangereusement
l'homéopathie.
être complotiste. Là, pendant un moment, je ne sais pas ce qui s'est passé, mais c'est dangereusement devenu complotiste. Donc, je me dois intervenir et de remettre la science là, à la place qu'elle mérite. On va dire ça.
Bien, merci pour
c'est
avoir
pas
lâché le
possible
mot.
à être dangereux parce que l'homéopathie ne fait rien. C'est-à-dire, c'est l'eau pure. Il fait rien. C'est pas dangereux
Alors,
parce
pourquoi
qu'il
est-ce que
y
vous
a
faites de
rien dedans.
l'homéopathie? Ça fait rien, en
Il
fait.
y a rien dedans. Il y a
La
rien
question.
dedans. Et il faut pas. And let me go back to English. It is
Alors, ça
also
marche pas, c'est rien dedans.
it is also the case that a good deal of medical treatment doesn't work for patients. And we don't get to say that. One of the things that I mentioned in my talk was that, and we're all going to face this right now on a world historical scale, all of us will take vaccines, not trialed in the ordinary way, a vaccine that no one else has ever taken before, because this is new to deal with a new virus and it's developed in a new way and it's super cool. That's also quite strange and quite funny. But nonetheless, we will take it. Why will we take it? Because my job will require it. Getting on a plane will require it. Maybe going to restaurants will require it. It doesn't matter. It'll be trivial. And we'll take it because, hey, if there are side effects, which there will be because there always are, one will say in advance that one does not want to have to be culpable for these. That was the example that I raised about the difficulty of knowing what's in any vaccine. And that means going back to Ludwig Fleck, when he fought the Nazis by giving them bad typhus vaccines. He was a very traditional doctor, an ordinary doctor. He prepared the serum, and the serum was a dud. That means it didn't work, and it was designed not to work. They couldn't tell, looked like an injection. All injections look alike. So the problem is not the question of saying, oh, homeopathy works. I didn't make that claim here, and I'm not arguing that one way or the other. And my claim about homeopathy is I don't know. You know, I don't. Now, the thing that we do want to say about vaccines is we want to say they work even if they don't. And that's going to be a big, big problem. And the part of me that's still a scientist really likes what's coming, because that part of me will see in the best way possible via a mass experiment on a scale you have to be able to talk about such things. So in real time, from the Sahara to, of course, Berlin and Paris and New York and San Diego, you're going to be able to see what happens to people. That could be interesting, but interesting in a very bad way. So one of the things we want to remember from the language of philosophy of science, and this is common to both continental and analytic philosophy of science, is over determination. So you have a number of things that are overdetermined in one way with regard to their meaning, and underdetermined when it comes to your empirical kind of underlying basis. Here, we're going to have to wait to see what the results will be. And the problem, it seems to me, when you talk about what is also to be found, because Alistair MacIntyre starts as a philosopher of science before, and a Marxist and a number of other things, before he becomes famous writing After Virtue. But you may notice that his After Virtue begins with a science experiment gone wrong, where everybody just hates science because science is so bad. And then he also talks about incommensurable schemes. He doesn't use the word hermeneutic. What he does use is a term which you'll also find in ordinary analytic philosophy, which has to do with conceptual incommensurability. And one of the problems, it's also what Kant talks about when he goes through in the Critique of Pure Reason, the very great difficulty of resolving an argument. if you can make an argument on the one side for one conclusion, and you can make a valid argument on the other side for another conclusion, you haven't proven either. What you've determined is that you cannot determine it. It is indeterminable. And that, of course, is also the basis of Gödel. And now we're back to the Vienna Circle.
J'aurais une question sur un tout autre sujet, si vous me permettez, qui est sur le concept de cybernétique, quelque chose dont j'avais parlé longuement avec Nicolas. Parce qu'il me semble qu'on fait souvent référence à la cybernétique, disons juste comme modèle conceptuel, mais on ne le concrétise pas avec disons, avec le monde actuel, mais on le garde seulement comme modèle de concrétisation possible. Et c'est vrai que la théorie des systèmes, elle est assez séduisante, mais il me semble qu'elle elle ne produit pas de connaissances parce qu'on la garde souvent juste à l'état de, disons, de modélisation possible. Et quand on veut l'appliquer au monde, on voit que c'est tellement compliqué qu'elle est pratiquement inutilisable. Donc, à quoi sert ce concept?
And there is a question by Enrico that is completing this question by Jonathan.
Yes.
Written.
There is another question or just a question?
No,
Oh,
I mean, yeah, you understood.
Okay.
Yeah, but there is also, I don't know if you understood the question by Jonathan.
I did, and I understood there was a second follow-up question. Or
exactly, but the question is, I mean,
that right? Okay.
It was written by Enrico on the trail of question on the chat.
It's a brilliant question. Cybernetics is considered. I agree with both points. I think that both points are pointing to a genuine difficulty that is there. Nonetheless, if you want to read Sloterdijk, if you want to read Heidegger, if you want to read Anders, you have to go, and this actually goes back to this. I love the name, random EPFL guy. I love it. It's glorious. But this very powerful question that was asked, a very important question about the question of efficacy, you know, and induction, which is David Hume's question. So we want to see positives, and we want to see it works, it doesn't work. But what do we mean by that? So that you have a dead, you could say, project, and yet I'm not sure the project is entirely dead. So the worry that I have, and this is something that Latour also looks at in his own writing, it is to try to go back to forgotten texts of the past, to try to see what their presuppositions were. To say that it doesn't work, which I think I agree with you, is to miss what underlies the project as such, which is what I am talking about as a simple circuit. It is, that's why I'm not saying this admiringly when I say cybernetics 101. It's not positive for me. C'est cybernétique pour les bébés. This is not an achievement. I think it's not complicated, but it is extraordinarily, because it flies beneath the surface of consciousness on our radar. And then you must step back to the Frankfurt School, who were also phenomenologists. Many people do not know that Adorno was a follower of the same phenomenological tradition that via Cornelius, but also Husserl, that inspires Heidegger and Gunther Anders. So there's a commonality which is completely forgotten with Habermas. In these older traditions, which looks at something more significant, and it is what Nicola was saying about this existentialist side, but I would say it's more nuanced than that, because this looks to what culture is. The interesting thing about that level of cybernetics is how very effective it is. It is the reason one should read Friedrich Kittler. Now, Friedrich Kittler is loved by Kittlerites. and hated by everyone else who's never heard of him. But one of the interesting things about Kittler is that he attends to the most basic mechanical level of things. And this is what I find very interesting, because it is because of little pings in the ears on the headphones. Matthew, I see wonderfully, Kruger-Ross is wearing these great headphones, but so did pilots from Germany when they were attacking Coventry. And when those pilots attacking Coventry were listening, they couldn't see a thing. Most pilots can't see anything anyway, as something we learned from psychology, brain psychology, and of course visual science. They can't see. That's why you have automatic pilots which land the plane for you, because no pilot learns how to land a plane because it's too complicated, because you can't see, because your eyes didn't evolve. This is evolution. This is very simple stuff, to be able to come down at that speed and land anywhere. Which is why, this is very important, James Gibson develops an entire means of, when he's at MIT, a way to prevent pilots from killing themselves. Because it's really expensive to train pilots. And if none of them can land, it's not good. So you don't get Top Gun, you have a serious problem in reality. What did those pilots use? They couldn't see, and they didn't have automatic pilot because cybernetics was only in a dream in someone's head. They used pings of radio that went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Those of you who are ham radio enthusiasts might know something about that. But at a particular point, when you're moving, if you're riding at the top of a semi in a truck and you're going down the highway, it's also a lovely Kantian experiment of space and time. You will find at a certain moment when you pass that there will be a resonant frequency. You'll also get some of this on a Zoom, a regular Zoom call occasionally. It's really horrible, but it's the same phenomenon. That interference pattern was used because exactly when those pings intersected, dropped the bomb. And that's how they did it. So they were able to triangulate. It's GPS and its nascent development, but using radio signals and the plane. And of course, Sloterdijk writes about that as well. It's something that we philosophers pay no attention to because we figure it's done. And we know stuff for a fact. We don't, but we're learning. And that's one of the reasons why they walk around with those Google trucks photographing everything, because they're increasing and replicating what will eventually be this incredible, Baudrillard writes about this map of everything that matches on utterly to everything. That was a very difficult question. I have answered it by saying I agree with you. I have answered it by saying that cybernetics does fail as we understand it. It's the presuppositions that we have forgotten that we need to go back to, and that are still operative in our, what I would call feedback devices, which is why I talked about the haptic that's involved with this. Or if you pay for a dating app, where you swipe left and swipe right, at a certain point you have to actually pay for it, because you get into the habit of just swiping the wrong way, because that one's not cute and that one's not cute and yuck and no way, and suddenly, and then you just swipe the wrong person away that you want, and you can't undo it unless you pay.
Merci beaucoup pour cette réponse.
Je vais me permettre d'ajouter mon grain de sel. Puis-je le faire en français?
Oui. Absolument.
Alors, en fait, moi, j'ai rencontré la cybernétique en lisant Baudrillard il y a longtemps.
Oui.
Et c'est vrai il parle beaucoup de cybernétique et sans jamais expliquer ce que c'est. Par la suite, j'ai découvert ce que c'est, et peut-être que pour moi, c'est quelque chose de plus que ce qu'on imagine. Mais c'est vrai que pour moi, j'ai fait de la sociologie. J'ai découvert qu'on avait, enfin en sociologie, qui était aussi une sociologie très positiviste à Genève, on a énormément la boîte noire, hein, avec la flèche qui part de la boîte noire et le feedback qui part vers l'environnement, et dont une partie de cette flèche qui représente ce que une entité, comment une entité agit, ou quelles sont les informations qu'une entité donne à son environnement, et le feedback qui est la partie de l'activité externe de cette entité vers son environnement, qui revient et qui agit en retour. C'est l'environnement qui réagit en retour sur l'entité. Et c'est vrai que ça m'a donné l'impression que déjà c'était présent en sociologie, après j'ai vu ça que c'était également en biologie, et là j'ai découvert par la suite que la cybernétique était quelque chose qui avait à voir avec Darwin aussi, et avec le concept d'émergence, et ça m'a donné l'impression, après j'ai découvert qu'il y avait aussi ça dans la psychologie, avec une école systémique très connue de Palo Alto qui a utilisé le schéma cybernétique pour analyser comment fonctionne l'esprit. Et ça m'a donné une sorte de réponse par rapport à la question de la détermination et de la liberté. Et ça m'a donné l'impression que j'ai adopté ce schéma, ça m'a plu et ça m'a donné l'impression que, en fait, si on analyse cybernétiquement notre existence, on verra que l'on est sans arrêt, non pas en train d'agir, mais de réagir à un continuel flux d'action-réaction et que l'on est en train, comment dire, aussi ça met en avant le fait que petit à petit, on est programmé par tous les stimuli que l'on reçoit et que l'on est le résultat de tous les stimuli que l'on reçoit. Et ça m'a aidé, j'ai eu l'impression que ça me permettait de voir de plus loin, de manière plus claire, quelle était la façon dont on était déterminé. Et j'ai l'impression que beaucoup de gens se considèrent à partir de ce schéma comme un flux de conscience qui doit se réguler lui-même. Et dans cette... et il me semble que de cette façon, on pourrait dire que les gens, en général, dans notre société, appliquent un schéma cybernétique, comme par exemple un ami qui me dit « j'ai trouvé un life hack ». À savoir que ce life hack, donc il hack sa vie, c'est-à-dire qu'il sait qu'il est programmé, mais qu'il peut prendre du recul et se déprogrammer, comme par exemple en mettant son iPhone en noir et blanc, ce qui lui permet de moins subir les stimuli agressifs qui nous sont envoyés par la Silicon Valley. Et c'est vrai que sous cet aspect, il me semble que la cybernétique est très, très présente. On pourrait penser aussi à, par exemple, des choses comme du développement personnel corporate, un peu, comme par exemple la programmation neurolinguistique qui utilise la cybernétique. Et il y a beaucoup d'autres exemples où la cybernétique a fait des petits, si j'ose dire, a engendré des phénomènes ou des domaines, des techniques qui se basent sur ces concepts.
Fantastic. So this is a very beautiful question. It's very, it has all of the elements that resolves all of its own aspects itself. And I really am grateful for this because it really helps pull things together in an important way. One of the things I was trying to point to is that you've got to pick your words very carefully, especially if you want to succeed in philosophy. I happen to be a professor. I happen to have a certain amount of freedom, but and I'm not famous like Agamben. But if you say the wrong things, people will attack you and they will call you a conspiracy theory, complotiste. I read in the notes here, or say some real science, or things that are otherwise terribly, terribly unkind and terribly not coherent with what is actually being said, because it's to raise a question. That's what philosophy of science is meant to do, to ask questions about science, to actually ask a question. This is why Friedrich Nietzsche says he's the very first person to ask the question of science as a question. And he thinks that that's what you need to do. And I agree. I think that that's what Nietzsche does. But most people, and this was the first question that was asked, very important first question, what's the difference? Why would you have these critical questions, and why would analytic philosophy not have them? Because analytic philosophy is aiming for success, and therefore will not take any risk of having anyone think that they are not in cahoots with the received view. So that means they have to do what everyone says you should do, and that means they have to follow dogma. And if we read our Plato, We should know that there's a danger there for the philosophaster as opposed to the philosopher. We should know that, but we tend to forget it. And the other point, which I think I would like to note, is that if I had not said cybernetic, and I wanted to say cybernetic because I wanted to bring in Gunther Anders, you know, and Gunther Anders, who's been dead for forever, was nonetheless alive and well when I was writing my dissertation, and people told me you don't study with him because he's a conspiracy theorist, the words they use then, and he's crazy and he's wrong, which I'm very annoyed at this point, because he in fact had something to say. He's impossible to read. He writes in a very Viennese and very German way, non-academic, but he is extremely important because he's doing something philosophers should do, and that is paying attention to the real order. That's what he says. And he had big fights with Adorno. They were friends. And I think he would have had fights with Benjamin because he thought that theorizing in the social order about ideas was a waste of time, and you needed to march. You needed to revolt. You needed to do things. So he carried cards against atom bombs, which was the wrong thing to do. He would have been very successful if he wrote against the concentration camps. But instead, he went to America, wrong place to do this, and wrote about Nagasaki and Hiroshima, which one was, by law, not allowed to mention. So we have dogma, and we have political dogma, and it is always used for repression, and one should be mindful of that. Why is this relevant when we are talking about necropolitics? Because people die, because there are consequences of these acts, because we're living through this, and also because I'm a Heideggerian. And I've spent most of my time as a Heideggerian having to listen to people say to me, well, Heidegger was a Nazi, and therefore, why are you reading him? And it's a very powerful question. It's not unimportant. It is serious. I take it seriously. But when you ask that question, what you are assuming is that were you in Heidegger's situation, you would act differently. I see no one among the academics that I know, with the exception of Giorgio Agamben, who has said anything against the current regime. And all Agamben did was ask a question and not know. For that, he was declared, you know, just beyond the pale, the worst ever, lost his mind, completely insane, conspiracy theory, totally creepy. If you read what he wrote, nothing of that is in what he writes. He's too careful for that. But he was nonetheless, the anger that I saw on Twitter and in colleagues and in articles written against Agamben made me think these are the same people who would say that Heidegger should have said certain things. Agamben has just said certain things and they're going nuts. So I just didn't quite understand how, you know, it seems you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. And this is something that I think one should worry about. It's also our world. So it seems to me that we need to at least think about what positions we are and are not taking, and what complicity we have with what is being done in our names. And now I'm quoting Agamben. This is done in our names, all of our names. So one has to think about that.
Une idée intéressante qui est soulevée par votre citation de la cybernétique, et je constate d'ailleurs que Babette avait mentionné l'œuvre de Norbert Wiener, qui est vraiment le père anglophone de la cybernétique. Une idée centrale de la cybernétique, c'est justement ce qu'on appelle en anglais le feedback, retour d'information en français, je sais pas. On dit feedback. Enfin,
feedback. Oui, feedback en français.
Et la question qui se pose est justement de l'importance de réfléchir sur quelle sera l'importance du feedback de ce que nous à quoi nous sommes subis maintenant, c'est-à-dire depuis nous sommes 10 mois, on vit sous un régime différent qu'auparavant. Il y a certainement un feedback qui vient de ça. on s'habitue par exemple à obéir aux directives de Macron. Je ne sais pas, c'est pas nécessairement faux, c'est pas nécessairement ridicule, mais il y aura un feedback de tout ça. Et si ça continue pour encore 6 mois, 10 mois, comme nous prédit le docteur Fauci, eh bien, le feedback sera de plus en plus intense. Et ça va faire une différence de comment nous concevons notre vie et notre existence. Et je ne sais pas quelle sera où nous serons, mais ça ne va pas être la même chose qu'auparavant. C'est tout.
Ouais,
Je n'avais pas voulu mettre fin aux interjections.
Oui, je sais pas, moi j'ai l'impression effectivement que la cybernétique, qui s'appelle aussi, me semble-t-il, quoique certains prétendent que c'est un peu différent, la théorie des systèmes est quand même très en vogue aussi dans le management, dans la psychologie par exemple, on peut regarder, il y a des brochures de la CIA qui parlent d'opérations psychologiques, puisque Babette, vous parliez de ça, où justement on voit comment est-ce qu'on peut habituer quelqu'un à faire quelque chose à travers une habituation progressive. C'est aussi en fait la psychologie behavioriste qui est très proche des concepts de la cybernétique, ou peut-être dont la cybernétique est sortie. Mais la psychologie behavioriste, c'est exactement ce dont provient tous les phénomènes dont parle Babette Babich, qui sont utilisés par la Silicon Valley pour conceptualiser la façon dont les gens réagissent et s'habituent, ou on crée une habituation progressive avec pas des stimuli, mais des boucles de stimuli qui reviennent régulièrement et qui font qu'on est aussi, on est au-delà de la vision d'une causalité linéaire qui est celle qu'on a à la première personne. C'est-à-dire qu'on on est dans une série de boucles dans lesquelles la personne dans lesquelles on programme la personne en quelque sorte par quelque chose qui tourne de manière répétée, comme par exemple lorsque vous êtes en train de jouer et que vous avez une gratification et que ça vous engage à repartir pour un tour, continuer et avoir une autre gratification à la fin, etc. Et c'est programmé, ce genre de choses, par exemple par Angry Birds, pour que vous ne vous arrêtiez jamais. Et c'est dénoncé également dans la presse, qui en parle de plus en plus, et où les gens se rendent de plus en plus compte que la Silicon Valley, quelque part, nous manipule à travers cette façon de nous prendre pour des pigeons, littéralement.
One thing to remember, and I showed a couple of times the cover of my book because I got to design it, so I like it, the Hallelujah Effect. One thing I noticed, and it did surprise me, that if you were interested in philosophy, we have this notion of free will, and we have compatibilism and determinism and various other ways of understanding that language. And philosophy is very specific about its language. But what I noticed was that if I read journal articles written by psychologists in psychology, the social science of psychology, they would universally deny anything but the general efficacy of programming. That is to say, if you watch Coca-Cola commercials, you will, maybe if you're thirsty, want Coke. And that it's simply that. And that's on the same lines as there's no such thing as the cybernetic. However, what I found to my shock is that if I went to business school, Fordham has a business school, and we have a school of management. And so there are different academic standards and different language for a school of management in psychology than there are in research psychology. And it turns out that at Yale, the same psychologist who published research on programming in psychology articles and got a lot of grief and a lot of criticism, published those same articles in business schools, same articles as far as I could see, and I read both of them, where those were then the gold standard, as it were, and literally. Because what business wants, unlike philosophy and unlike social science, is what works. They actually want what is it, random EPL guy, EPFL guy wants. They want something that works all the time. But one of the things that the business school will do to its executives is give them an empirical example of such programming. We deny cybernetic efficacy. We deny that we are programmable. We deny that our freedom can be influenced. Even as our freedom is programmed and influenced, we deny it. So in business school, they would tape record people by video to show them. They would then interview them and ask them whether they were programmed and what they had done. All of them denied it. Some of them continued denying it even after seeing on video their actions. So one of the things that's very interesting about people, is that we have beliefs. And these beliefs we maintain in the face of cognitive dissonance. It's a very strange, it's why we have religion, it's very complicated. Nietzsche writes about this, others write about this. It should be a subject of philosophy, but it's hard for it to be a subject of philosophy because if I am right, and I may not be, but if I am right that analytic philosophy wants to be on the side of the sciences, it's got to pick its science. Is it going to be management science, which is STEM, which maybe philosophy will have to decide to be for because it bakes bread and there's money there? Or will it be on the side of the more experimental sciences, and that's more complicated? So social science pure might be more difficult to follow because even the social scientists have to wear different hats. If I wrote the same article and I wanted to be a success, I'd talk about big data. I wouldn't use the word cybernetics. I'd use AI. I would talk about data mining. I would use different language borrowed from different traditions. I'd say the same thing, but I wouldn't trigger any negative responses if I was looking for success. I would also have successfully hidden anything that I would want to say. So there's a problem. You really can't do that and not get a little crazy, but schizophrenic. But it can be done. And when you want to get an article published in a journal, you've got to be very careful that people don't write similar responses, reviewer A and reviewer B, about your article. So you have to, you mentioned that I publish a lot of things, but and I've seen a lot of negative comments, but I've also know something about giving advice to my own students and how to because not everybody wants to follow questions. As Nietzsche says, if you want comfort, it's better to follow belief. If you want truth, you're gonna have to research. I've always tried to research.
Je reprends la parole puisque je crois qu'il n'y a plus de questions. Je voulais... ça me fait penser à votre façon de parler disons, de pourquoi il y a la philosophie analytique. Pour la philosophie analytique, c'est parce que la philosophie n'était pas claire et qu'elle est arrivée et elle a clarifié les choses. C'est le récit de la philosophie analytique et vous montrez les choses assez intéressantes qui font que pratiquement c'était utile parce que ça permet de, comment dire, vous peignez presque la philosophie analytique un peu comme le management, parce qu'il fallait qu'il y ait quelque chose qui permettent disons, aux gens de se parler, que peut-être la philosophie classique fait que, disons, qu'un heideggerien parlera heideggerien et aura de la peine à parler avec un cartésien, et qu'un nietzschéen aura de la peine à parler avec un carnapien, ou là c'est un mauvais exemple, avec un kantien, non pas un philosophe analytique, mais disons qu'il y avait une nécessité pour que, voilà, il fallait que ça parle en quelque sorte. Hein.
Oui, oui. I like very much that you go back to the complicated question of all of the tribes in philosophy and the difficulty that they have speaking to one another. I think that the reason I care is because if philosophy, for me, when I started studies in 1980, when Gadamer was 80 years old, which is why I went to study with him, because he wasn't dead yet, he wouldn't die for 22 years. If philosophy in 1980 had been, contrafactual notice, had been what it is today, I would not study philosophy. That is to say, it would be boring beyond belief. Why would one bother? So to me, one talks about tiny problems, giddy problem, one talks about trolley problem, one talks about getting an argument clear, one ignores everything Kant says, one ignores everything Nietzsche says, one ignores everything Heidegger says and looks for what he's really trying to say, which is nonsense, because one has already bracketed hermeneutics, and you're not trying to interpret what Heidegger has said. The same thing applies to the world, because I am a philosopher of science, and I think Nietzsche is right when he says, Die Welt ist unsagbar kompliziert. A very important comment. It is true, it is one of the reasons that the question about homeopathy is so important and also so misleading. The world is very complicated, and not to pay attention to its complexities makes it dangerous to understand. One should pay attention to the physiology of each individual living human being to do any kind of medicine for that person. We don't. In fact, as a woman, I will tell you something that's very, very dangerous. All of our vaccine trials and all of the doses that Tracy was talking about receiving from his doctors are based on the white male. In Italy, very important research, and only there apparently, has been empirically done on some of the dangers of using the white male as a standard for women, pregnant women who are going into menarche, women in menopause, and children, not to mention blacks. I mean, we've got a real problem with race, but people are extremely different one to another. Are the Swiss different from the Swabians? I spent a lot of time in Tübingen, I'm not so sure. But I think the Swiss would disagree with me. And I think I know the Swabians would. They think they are, and it's very, very significant the way the Germans think of themselves. They see themselves as Stammen. The hell's a Stamme? You know, as an American, and as someone with a background in biology, knowing something about Darwin, how the hell do you translate Stamme into English? The best I can do is turn them into Iroquois and Crow Indians, and that's a mistake. So there's a whole set of problems that are involved in this complexity, whether it's on the level of philosophy with the different tribes of philosophy trying to talk to each other, and they're not trying to talk to each other. Because my fatal mistake in this lecture would be to use the word cybernetics in order to talk about people who talk about it. That's all I did. It's not my word, I'm not for it. But if you want to read Gunther Anders, you're going to have to read that word, because that's what he talks about, because in 1956, it was cutting edge. It's not anymore. Of course not. But I think one should read him. It's about time. So I'm trying to do a little bit of that, but I'm also trying to raise questions about what I think Heidegger says that's very valuable, and that is that the essence of technology is nothing technological. And I think that's part of the point of Techno-Scotosis. We don't see anything. I mean, when I started using an iPhone and an iPad, I used to get all these screen cleaners and I used to clean the surface. And I don't care how much of a clean freak you are, I don't think you do that anymore because people don't care anymore. It's a very interesting thing. You still leave as much grease on the surface of your screen. It is still as much of a source of contamination in a hospital as it ever was, because bacteria love grease. I mean, anything with a cell wall loves grease because the cell walls are bilipid. It's like, yay, grease. They love grease. Your iPad, the doctor uses in order to communicate things, is a tremendous source of all manner of infection. But we don't pay attention to it. Techno-Scotosis. We don't see it. We see through the screen and we are on the other side of the screen. And this is, of course, you need phenomenology to understand that, which is why, that was the comment in the joke about pornography, which is why it works.
There is a question by a random
Not reading this thing, it's
ETFL
hard for me.
guy,
Yes,
which is, can we
I love
associate
that name.
the success, or let's say the essor, of philosophy analytic, of la philosophie, of analytic philosophy, to the fact that we are in a golden age of reason?
Okay. I will agree. I will agree with anything that attests to the success of analytic philosophy, because I will be the first person to tell someone who says to me, I want to study continental philosophy, where can I go? And my answer is nowhere. There is no continental philosophy taught at any university, not mine, not any other university that I know, not at Boston College, nowhere. There is no continental philosophy. One of the reasons I wrote this little book, Le Fin de la Pensée, is because I thought, how can that be in France? They are so brave. They are so wonderful. How could they possibly, they invented, talk about this age of reason with Descartes. How could they possibly do this? Plus, the person whom was nominated to the Collège de France was my colleague, Claudine Tiercelin. I think she's married to, or was perhaps, but still is, Pascal Engel. So very close connections. And I thought, what was the problem? In La Nouvelle Observateur, the problem was a word that no one understood. I used the word cybernetics. People had trouble understanding the context in which I meant it. They misunderstood me. Fine, I accept that because I am trained in hermeneutics from Gadamer, and I know you need to explain yourself, and I know you need to come back and clarify, and I know there needs to be conversation and give and take, and one eventually, with kindness, might understand. We call that hermeneutic generosity. You've got to. Nietzsche calls it love. You know, Nietzsche was a little bit romantic. Gadamer just called it generosity. You need to give the other person a break. If you won't give, and analytic philosophy gives no one a break. That's its point. The whole point of analytic philosophy, and I went to BU, which is where they did philosophy of science, which is what I wanted to do. Everyone was nasty to everyone. That's what one did. It was also one of the reasons why we talk about feminism in philosophy as much as we do, because it's an absolutely unkind climate for women, because women are not good at being nasty, not quite as good as men are. They're much better. So they don't stand a chance. Now we have rules. Diversity, you have to be nice. But how can analytic philosophy follow that? Because that means you have to, what do you have to do? Castrate your argument? It's completely impossible. So how will one survive? The problem is a matter, very, very much a matter for me, of losing a tradition, losing the ability to make distinctions in French, losing the ability. I just finished a book today, which is why I was a little bit late and why I'm a little bit my brain is in German at the moment, because that book is written in German. I have waited all of my life to be able to write a book on Nietzsche in which I don't have to say Nietzsche means by this, and I explain it. You can't explain German in English. You can't explain French in English. You're going to need the language itself. It is something the linguists talk about. It is also something we joke about with one another. But what we have done, and this is a very grave thing, and this is why I wrote that book, and I regret it, as I say, because I'm not good enough to have written it in the best way that I possibly could, in the best French that I possibly could, because it's impossible. But if I had been able to do it, I would have hoped to do what no one who speaks French could do, although the person who objected to Claudine Tiercelin's lecture at the Collège de France at that time, as she was accepting her chair, was to say, what the hell is qualia? Qualia. Qualia is an ordinary word that analytic philosophers use all the time. And someone who passed a bac and so knew something about philosophy simply didn't know what the word meant and thought it was Latin. It is, but it doesn't mean what the dictionary tells you it means, not in philosophy. And that's why he was confused. So I said, what have the French done to themselves? And so I said, well, we will think about it, but it was not as if one could change that. It's been lost. The fact that I am speaking in English, because I am very old, is to me a travesty. I can speak French. I could have written this talk in French. I could have given this talk in French. And if I had done that, which I didn't have time to do, I would have gone over the bridge to the way I should have spoken to you so that you might be able to hear a little bit of what I was saying. Would I succeed? I don't know. I'd make mistakes, but I would at least have been going to you. And I think this is very important because one speaks in English, you have to come to me. And I assure you, you can't, because the background, that information that I'm drawing on is just its own other world. And it's also rich. So I would go to reach the riches on your side because to me, that's more interesting. And so I would want to do that. Why should you come to me? You shouldn't, but I would want to go to you. If I speak English, you must. You have no choice. Whether I'm an analytic philosopher or a continental philosopher, and I'm an analytic philosopher who teaches logic, and I'm a continental philosopher who teaches logic, a continental philosopher who teaches philosophy of science, and who's read a lot of analytic philosophy. That's the other thing. That's the difference between analytic and continental philosophy. Analytic philosophers don't read continental philosophers at all. They have no idea. They have no lexicon. They have no way of translating. They don't read their stuff. They don't quote them. Continental philosophers often try to quote analytic philosophers, not badly, unsuccessfully, but they make an effort. They read them. They've read them. And what they do, and that's why you can't study continental philosophy anywhere in the world, they hire them. So when we hire someone to do continental philosophy at Fordham University, we will hire someone from Harvard, where you cannot learn to do continental philosophy. And we will not hire someone from a so-called continental department. And neither will, since I'm often asked to review people for promotion, neither will any other school. So one of the things we've done is created a ghetto of analytic philosophy that has cut off the most interesting parts of philosophy and said, no, we won't do any of that. We will be boring forever and serve science. Science doesn't want the service. They decline. So exactly what does analytic philosophy do? For me, that's a question. So I have yet to figure it out. They're clear, but they're clear only to themselves because they're not clear to people in other disciplines, and they're not clear, I fear, to the people in science whom they mean to be a service to. So it's a bit of a disappointment on that side, and I worry because there is more, or just close to, we're getting a little bit close to, you want to be able to say 1,000 years, just like Nietzsche says, you want to Reich, but we don't really have that in the university. The university doesn't go back that far. But one would like not to lose most of it, and we're about to do so with the STEM and the movement to STEM, which many of us will support. And analytic philosophy will be happy to support it, but they will find they will be on the cutting block along with literature and along with some of the other fields not regarded as adequately scientific by the scientists who will be asked. And none of them will be interested in what philosophers of science have to say, not me and not other philosophers of science. We're all equally bad from the perspective of the sciences. We're all equally unscientific from the perspective of the sciences. That's something to remember.
J'ai une dernière question, si vous me le permettez. pour revenir à ce que vous avez dit, et pour parler peut-être un peu de l'avenir de la philosophie continentale en général, est-ce que vous ne pourrez pas répondre à vos élèves qui vous demandent où il faut aller étudier la philosophie continentale, peut-être, dans des écoles d'art, peut-être celle de Karlsruhe, peut-être une autre,
Absolument.
et que peut-être qu'il faut se résigner en tant que philosophe continentaux à faire des choses comme soit comme Sloterdijk d'un côté, soit comme peut-être revenir à Bachelard et, s'intéresser au disons euh, à, à la pureté des intuitions comme phénomène. C'est peut-être ça le seul champ qui nous reste.
Oui,
Qu'est-ce que vous en
c'est vrai.
pensez?
Oui, mais tout à fait, c'est vrai, mais c'est ça, this is the problem. C'est ça, c'est le problème. On peut dire, il y a une chance, c'est le même mot en français et en allemand, c'est intéressant, surtout pour la Suisse. Donc, the problem, though, is that it's art. And it's not taken seriously, even among artists. So you have that as a problem. I have spoken at Karlsruhe with Sloterdijk. I gave a different lecture, but it's not. There is a sense in which he's free to do whatever he wants. And who's there now? Latour, Bruno Latour, en français, speaking to Yukui, I quoted him, who wrote The Philosophy of Technology, Question Concerning Technology in China. Just last Saturday, he had a Zoom with Latour, the two of them talking about digital objects and the cybernetic again. But where? Karlsruhe. Who is taking this seriously? Where is it heard? It is a piece of art. And if it's a piece of art, the trouble is we have learned not to take art seriously. And this is a problem with conceptual art and modern art and contemporary art and art as art. So you are right that maybe you get a job, but then how long does that last? And for how many people? And what about philosophy departments? So for me, as part of a curriculum, all the university curricula that I know of are really interwoven with one another. You need to include the languages, you need to include the sciences, you need to include history, you need to have various complements and components to have a university education. The shift that is coming, and Zoom is part of that, and I'm teaching online, so I know, is to move away from what had been traditional university instruction. If everything is the Khan Academy, if everything is a simple YouTube video, you have a problem. Someone said to me, and I was very insulted, he wrote me an email asking for advice, but he also said, I have seen your YouTube lectures and you are not chatty. Chatty meaning you're not casual in your conversations, you're not relaxed. Most people are, this is philosophy, it means this. And it's true, most people give YouTube lectures, Zoom lectures, just the way they gave regular lectures face-to-face. They put their hands in their pockets and they drone at you. They don't make an effort to come to you. And this is, for me, one of the problems for if you have a job and you have a position. Right now, analytic philosophy is really confident because it's got all the jobs. It's got all the posts. But I believe that is about to change, and it terrifies me as an educator, as a thinker, as someone who cares about the life of the mind, because it's not a strong position from which to fight for the distinctiveness of philosophy. If what makes philosophy distinctive is that it's clear and that it talks about the mind, neuroscience can do it better. Neuropsychology can do it better. Neurolinguistics can do it better. And this is, regular linguistics can do it better. What do you need philosophy for? What is its specific thing? The claim that philosophy teaches you how to reason and how to argue is an insult to physics. They know how to reason. They know it in math and they know it in music. So it means that you're basically walking into the university senate with a chip on your shoulder. you people don't know how to think critically, which is just not true. Of course they do. It's a piece of cake to think critically. It doesn't take any energy. We teach our students in an analytic philosophy class how to think critically in the first week of a philosophy class. And then we repeat that instruction until a PhD program. There's no advance. And to me, what are we losing? And when you start reading Heidegger, then what blows you away is what's going on in the sentence, between the sentences, between the paragraph. He's assuming so much that we haven't read, don't see, don't know, and is there to know. You know, that was why I thought mention the fact that this lecture in Davos is a prelude to being in time, because it is. So it's handy to know, and you know, it's always good to think of some place nearby. I assume I have this fancy that it's nearby. I'm of course not that I'm saying nonsense to you, but I still have that fancy.
Il faut signaler aussi qu'il y a un livre de... Enfin, j'ai l'impression qu'il y a des analytiques qui disent la même chose que Babette, en fait. Il y a un livre notamment de Peter Hunger, qui est un philosophe on ne peut plus analytique, qui s'appelle Empty Ideas, qui est sorti il y a 2-3 ans, et qui vraiment, d'après je ne l'ai pas lu, mais j'ai lu le compte-rendu, qui semble, j'en suis désolé, voilà, c'est la pratique assez commune, mais en tout cas, dans le compte-rendu, je voyais exactement le contenu du livre de Babette où il parlait qu'on avait formé une sorte d'académisme formaliste qui répétait les mêmes choses depuis 50 ans et que maintenant, on s'en rend compte et qu'on se pose des questions. Donc, en tout cas, lui se pose des questions et je crois que Jacques Bouvres aussi, qui semble, au début d'une conférence qu'il introduisait, semblait dire qu'effectivement, on avait raté des trucs. Et c'était une conférence sur la philosophie de l'esprit, qui est une des parties de la philosophie analytique, la partie où il s'occupe de l'esprit, où il disait qu'ils avaient raté le coche parce que la façon dont les neurosciences raisonnaient sur l'esprit n'avait rien à voir avec la façon dont les philosophes analytiques raisonnent sur l'esprit, à savoir notamment que les neurosciences, à travers aussi les modélisations qui sont utilisées avec les réseaux de neurones, avec la neuroinformatique, avec l'informatique, on fait des modélisations qui, je ne sais pas si elles ressemblent exactement à la façon dont fonctionne un cerveau biologique, mais ces réseaux de neurones sont des machines synthétiques qui gèrent une complexité qu'on leur présente et qu'elles analysent d'une manière synthétique, à savoir que les philosophes analytiques imaginaient peut-être au début, enfin ça donne cette impression, qu'ils créaient une description de comment l'esprit fonctionne et qu'à la fin, une machine pourrait comprendre comment l'esprit fonctionne. Et de la façon dont fonctionnent les réseaux de neurones, ce n'est pas du tout comme ça, ce n'est pas du tout avec des règles qu'on leur donnerait sur comment reconnaître une question, comment reconnaître une émotion, qu'elles fonctionnent, à savoir qu'on ne leur donne pas de règles pour savoir reconnaître une question. On leur montre 50 000 questions et après, elles savent ce que c'est qu'une question. Et les gens ne comprennent pas forcément, les gens qui programment ces machines ne comprennent pas forcément tous les détails de comment le réseau de neurones est arrivé à faire à produire cet output qui est qu'il reconnaît une question ou qu'il reconnaît une émotion ou qu'il reconnaît une voiture, par exemple.
Oui. Je suis there is also Peter Hacker, PMS Hacker, Peter Hacker, who has a similar very, very large book on the neurosciences, which is co-authored from a Wittgensteinian perspective that makes a similar argument. And I remember being on the committee as an analytic organization in the United States called the APA, the American Philosophy Association, the Eastern, when it was very, very huge and large. And I had to argue to get Hacker's book accepted on the program because he pointed to these complexities and problems with neuroscience and philosophy. So the question is, analytic philosophy sets itself certain tasks, then it has to do them. And if it falls short, it doesn't want to be called up on that. And that's, of course, a problem, because what you're pointing to is the question of how, you know, that is a cybernetic question. Garbage in, garbage out is the old joke. But how do you program your simulacrum? How, and we ran into this when sex dolls were popular. People were thinking about, you know, what kind of conversations can you have with them? But you've got to program those conversations. And then, especially for heterosexual sex dolls, that's a big problem, because it's mostly men who are the programmers. And as Freud points out, there's not a lot of understanding on the other side. So the charm and the seduction seem to be missing. And so there were great problems. But that's what you got, and you can't return them. So it's a good business model. Thank you. I also want to thank everyone who has posed these very difficult questions, because I live basically for questions, and so this was my last slide, which I didn't show. So I want you to know, and I've been looking at this the whole time because I didn't get there, but this is for me, and it is for anyone who reads Heidegger, the most important thing is to be able to genuinely question. And one of the problems with genuinely questioning, and it's the first part of Heidegger, is that in general, we already know the answer. And when we already know the answer, we're not asking a question. So for me, that is the essence of science as well, to get something new that you have discovered, which would be, you know, the very thing that Kant thought it would be, but it should also excite and inspire all of us to look for that novelty, that new discovery. And that's, I think, what questioning, if you really do it, and mostly, obviously, which is what Heidegger argues, we don't. I mean, this is one of the problems of prejudices, which is why I like Gadamer. We tend to have prejudices instead of openness, and it would be nice to try openness. Openness is hard, though, because it leads to that cognitive dissonance, and it upsets us. So you need to want to be upset a little bit, which takes us again back to our gadflies. So that's what we kind of need to have, kind of. But I'm not a big fan of Plato, but I still find myself quoting him. So there you have it. I am grateful to you.
Thank you. So I don't know if there is still some questions, or is it, yeah, we've been there for more than 2 hours now.
What, really? Okay, well then it is too much, because St. Augustine says you can only pay attention for 15 minutes, and the Jesuits insist 15 minutes and it's over. So
actually, Fourier says you can only pay attention for an hour and a half. It's called
really?
the Principe Papillon. And an hour and a half, and after that you have to change jobs. Or
change jobs. Okay. Change jobs. All right. Well, Augustine is kinder.
C'est Fourier, ça.
I heard you. I think that's fascinating. I like it that it's close to the
pour Fourier, c'est le base de l'organisation sociale. C'est-à-dire que on ne doit pas être obligé à faire quelque chose toute la journée. Chaque heure et demie, on change de travail. Et comme ça, on n'est jamais ennuyé.
Oui.
Sauf pour les petits. Les petits s'occupent des ordures parce qu'ils aiment ça.
Bon, alors ce sera la conclusion.
C'est quelle belle conclusion.
Très enthousiasmante.
Merci. Et merci Nicolas.
Ben, merci à vous et merci à tout le monde qui a été là.
To everyone, also to the names who have disappeared. Thank you also just for being there to make things large so that the faces are above. There is always a service.
Et Donc, ouais, j'ai oublié en fait de mettre l'adresse du groupe, mais je pense que vous pouvez tous la trouver. Elle est sur le flyer que vous avez reçu. Et voilà, ben, merci tout le monde. Thank you, Babette, immensely for this talk and your attention to us. And yeah, and your talk. It was very pleasurable, and I hope it will be done back once again, maybe later. And yeah, and thank you. Merci à tous d'avoir été là.
Voilà. Et voilà, bonsoir alors.
Bonsoir. Bye bye.
Bye.
Merci beaucoup. Bonsoir.
Au revoir, au revoir, au revoir, au revoir à tous. Bye bye.
Merci. Au revoir.
Ah, a voice. Thank you very much. Well, the voices are nice. That's very good.
Yeah.
That's also music. Okay.
We feel together, and we are in a way.
Right. Yes, indeed. Indeed. Thank you very much, Nicola, for all you have done for putting this together. I'm grateful.
Yeah, it was a pleasure, and finally we succeeded in it.
Well, I made a video, but that was useless. This was much better.
No, your video was great, really,
Oh,
and
okay.
I was also happy to see, because it's not very conscious in the public that Heidegger has an ethic, and I
yes.
read your paper and I liked it as your lecture. Your lecture was really great.
Okay, this is.
I advise people to hear it.
It was an advanced point. It is the whole complicated question that Heidegger says about authenticity. It also shows that Adorno's question about authenticity is false, because he's obviously being polemical, critical.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it's a very, but actually he was really writing about it. Yes, but that's so complicated. Anyway, too much complexity for tonight. Thank you so much. Have a good evening. And thank you also for your wonderful question on homeopathy. Very important question you raised, even if a bit harsh.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right then. So I go. Good evening. Bye.
Stay a bit.
Good evening too.
That's right. Bye now.
Random PFL.